Ray Thompson had the worst day of his life. He sat at the kitchen table, a glass of Buffalo Trace bourbon in his hand, staring straight ahead without taking a sip. For 10 whole minutes, he sat there, as if his world had frozen over. He couldn't see, couldn't hear, but he felt something so terrible that he knew there wasn't a drink on God's green earth that could numb this pain. Ray had heard of other men dealing with situations like this. You know the stories, a wives dropping the bomb, let's go exploring, find someone new. He'd always thought those were just tall tales, things you hear but don't believe. How could any faithful husband be okay with something like that? It was absurd to even consider, yet here he was. Of course, it was a Monday, it had to be. He'd had a good day at work, leaving the office at 5, whistling as he walked out. He'd been feeling pretty good, thinking he'd finally get to kick back for the evening. But there she was, Lizzie, sitting at the kitchen table, pouring herself a glass of Merlot. She'd placed his bottle of bourbon right next to her, as if she were preparing something twisted for some sort of celebration. He dropped his briefcase, poured himself a glass, and sat down at the table across from her. Noticing the strange smile, almost a smirk, on her face, he asked, "So, what's going on, Lizzie?" Her expression was unreadable as she looked into his eyes and then asked, "You think I've been a good wife all these years?" He frowned and replied, "Of course. What's this about?" A smirk remained on her face as she locked eyes with him. He tried to meet her gaze, but received only enough of the stare to make him shift uncomfortably. Her voice, low and strange, cut through the air. "So, Ray, do you really think I've been a good wife and mother all these years?" The question threw him off, and he raised an eyebrow. He'd always been proud of his ability to think things through, and she could see the gears turning in his head as he tried to answer. "Yeah. I think so," he said, trying to stay calm. "What are you getting at?" She let the silence stretch between them, as if weighing the moment, and then dropped it just like that. "I want to date another man. Tonight." Ray's stomach twisted, and all his thoughts vanished. "So, a date? With someone else?" he stammered, struggling to process what he'd just heard. Lizzie slowly nodded, looking at him like he was some kind of idiot. "Yeah, that's right. We started dating 20 years ago, and I haven't been with anyone else since. I've been a good wife and a good mom to our kids. But I'm 43 now, and I won't look this good forever. I'm just curious what else is out there. I deserve a little fun, not love." He could hardly believe what she was saying. The words hung in the air. This wasn't the Lizzie he thought he knew, but there she was, ready to trade their life for a fling. She wanted the thrill and was willing to throw it all away for a taste of something new. His jaw dropped as he felt the weight of her words sink in. There was no mistaking her meaning, and she meant every word. But he couldn't believe it. This couldn't be serious, could it? He glanced at Lizzie, who, seeing his expression, nodded. He watched as she stood up and headed upstairs to change. "Damn," he muttered under his breath. Moments later, she came down the stairs wearing a black dress that hugged her curves. The neckline dipped low on her chest, and the hem barely reached the middle of her thighs. Her makeup was subtle, just enough to highlight her features, and her hair was pulled back in a high ponytail. She looked stunning, and she knew it. For a moment, she caught him staring, and he finally found his voice. "No, this isn't happening," he said, standing up from the table. "It must be the bourbon talking, Lizzie. How can you just walk out of here and still call yourself my wife?" Her bright smile twisted into a smug grin. "Ray, you're not going to ruin my evening. You might talk big, but you're not really going to leave me over this. Where would you ever find someone like me again?" She spoke as if she held all the power, as if he was the one who didn't. Her tone grew sharper as she crossed her arms. "Face it, Ray. Where else would you go? You know you won't leave me. And think about the kids. They'd be furious if you tore our family apart. Just let me have my fun for a few years, and then we'll grow old together, just as we planned. You don't want to be alone, and I still have plenty of other options if things don't work out." A car horn honked outside, breaking the tension. With a glint in her eye, she grabbed her purse and strode over to him. She leaned in close to give him a quick peck on the lips, but he instinctively flinched, as if her touch might hurt. She was taken aback, a flicker of pain crossing her face before it turned cold and angry. "I'll be back later," she said, her voice edged with defiance. Who knows when? And then she was gone. She walked out the door, and he watched her leave, each step driving home the finality of it. Could it actually be over? Gone, just like that, 23 years of marriage, gone in a flash. Lizzie didn't even look back. He stood there, realizing how brutally true it was that good looks often give people an advantage. It seemed like beautiful people could glide through life, attracting attention and favoritism, while the rest were left picking up the pieces they left behind. Lizzie had learned early on that people treat those who look good differently. By 18, when her looks had fully blossomed, she knew just how powerful a weapon that could be. She discovered that with a flick of her eyelashes or a toothy smile, she could capture any boy's attention. And for those who didn't fall so easily, a subtle shift of her chest would seal the deal. Ray had fallen for Lizzie almost as soon as he met her. His family had just moved to town the summer before 8th grade. He was a good athlete, generally popular with other kids, but she was something else entirely. One night, he finally gathered the nerve to ask her out, and to his surprise, she agreed. They became a couple and stayed together through most of high school. But then junior year happened. One day, out of nowhere, she broke things off with him. She'd set her sights on Landon Ellis Jr., one of the big stars of their school's football team. Ray was devastated. At just 5 feet 4 inches, he was a scrawny kid who didn't stand a chance against someone like Landon. You don't get called a big baby for nothing. I was a 5 feet 4 inches kid, a little lighter than 110 pounds, while Landon was 6 feet 2 inches and close to 190. I was heartbroken, but I knew my place. I knew Lizzie was out of my league, especially in terms of looks. Most of the guys at our school thought the same. She was part of the popular crowd, the ones who ruled the halls. To them, I was just another face in the crowd. I had my friends and went on a few dates here and there, but I always kept Lizzie at arm's length. When we'd pass each other in the halls, she'd look right through me, like I didn't exist. The first time it happened, it stung, but I got used to it over time. By senior year, I had grown. I'm nearly 5 feet 11 inches now and a bit bulkier. I was in good shape, but I knew I'd never get back into Lizzie's world. By the time prom night rolled around, I was dating a sweet girl. She didn't sparkle, but she had a good heart, and we had a nice time. Lizzie, of course, was prom queen, standing beside a guy who was our prom king. They looked like they'd stepped out of a movie. Even with all her glamour that night, I knew Lizzie wasn't some untouchable goddess. She'd been with plenty of guys, and those who managed to snag her attention got to experience her charms. The guys who made it into her circle were always within reach for her. After high school, I went to Michigan State to study accounting. I dated a few girls during those years, but none of those relationships went anywhere. Lizzie went to Central Michigan University to study marketing. I'd hear rumors about her, and she was exploring the dating scene thoroughly. She even hooked up with a marketing professor to boost her grade from a B to an A. By pure coincidence, we both ended up back in Grand Rapids after college. I had graduated a year earlier, but one Friday night, Lizzie walked into a popular bar, flanked by 2 friends, while my colleagues and I were there to unwind. She was wearing a short green dress with a plunging neckline. When she walked through the door, heads turned. She didn't even try to command the room, but it was like it obeyed her. Steve White couldn't keep his thoughts to himself. He blurted out, "Who is that goddess?" as his eyes fixated on her. I chimed in, "Gentlemen, that's Lizzie, the so-called goddess." Here's a photo of her back when she was my 8th grade girlfriend." A chorus of surprised gasps followed, and suddenly the attention shifted from her to me. Someone asked, "How in the world do you know her?" I winced at the attention, I've never been one for the spotlight. But here I was, back in Lizzie's orbit after all these years. I leaned back and started talking quietly. Yeah, I was just one among many to her. In high school, I may as well have been invisible. For all 4 years, she didn't give me the time of day. It was like I didn't exist. One of the women at our table teased, "So, do you at least have a good story about getting handsy back then?" The whole group burst into laughter, catching Lizzie's attention. She glanced over and seemed to notice us for the first time. For a moment, I thought she recognized me, but then she quickly looked away and took a seat at a table across from us. "Aren't you going to say hello?" Steve urged, nudging me. "Come on, Steve. You're practically drooling," one of the guys teased, rolling his eyes. "It's embarrassing." I shrugged. She didn't act like I existed for 4 years. She wouldn't remember me now. We turned back to our drinks, and a few heads around the table nodded in agreement. Meanwhile, Lizzie kept glancing over at us, studying me. Eventually, she snapped her fingers and pointed in our direction. One of her friends warned, "Whoa, Lizzie, pointing at someone in public could get you in trouble." But Lizzie ignored her. Standing up with a smirk, she announced, "I'll be back." Lizzie practically jumped out of her chair and said, "I need to say hello to an old friend." Her confidence drew everyone's attention as she made her way over to our table. "Ray! I can't believe it!" She flashed the same smile that had gotten me back in 8th grade. I rolled my eyes at my friends and turned to her with a smile I didn't quite feel. I stood up and answered, "Lizzie, long time no see." Before I knew it, Lizzie leaned in and kissed me on the lips, just like she used to, placing her hands on my shoulders. My co-workers gawked, and I was too stunned to react. Lizzie, on the other hand, looked perfectly at ease, smiling mischievously. She was clearly enjoying her little act. "Come on over," she said, tugging my hand, "I'll introduce you to my friends." The rest of the evening, I spent with her and her 2 friends, catching up more publicly than I would have liked. As the night wound down, Lizzie punched her number into my phone and saved it. She even wrote down mine for herself. She seemed intrigued, probably more by my attitude than anything else. Throughout the evening, she kissed me a few more times, but I didn't reciprocate. By Monday morning, word had spread among my co-workers about my encounter with the goddess. They couldn't believe it and kept asking me about it over and over. I'd only been at the bar for about an hour before I left to go home. I shook my head, muttering, "Yeah, she's incredible, but she's leagues above me," as I put the phone down. I don't need that kind of drama in my life. But fate had other plans. 2 days later, as I was leaving work, I saw her standing in front of my car in the parking lot. I muttered to myself as I approached. Her dress was at least a size too small, but Lizzie still looked like pure temptation. The low-cut top was unbuttoned just enough, and her dress barely reached mid-thigh as she leaned against the car. I walked up to her, and she asked softly, "Why didn't you call, Ray?" I tried to hold back my surprise, feeling like a starving man finding a banquet. She had a playful smirk as she looked at me. She closed the distance between us, wrapping her arms around my neck and pulling me into a kiss. "Damn," I muttered under my breath. She barely gave me a second to react before her tongue slipped into my mouth, wrapping around me like a snake. Before I knew it, my briefcase had slipped from my hand and hit the ground with a thud. The kiss felt endless, and by the time we broke apart, I was gasping for breath. A couple of my colleagues were nearby, staring at us with wide eyes. When they saw the scene, my co-workers got in their cars and quickly drove away, leaving me alone with Lizzie. We ended up at a small restaurant on the edge of town, away from the usual crowds. We sat across from each other, and she kept tugging at the hem of her dress, which barely covered anything. Even the young waitress couldn't help but notice and seemed amused by Lizzie's struggle. I should have known better, but I found myself mesmerized, just as I had been all those years ago. Lizzie still had a spell over me. By the end of lunch, I knew exactly where things were headed. Back at her place, she slipped out of her clothes, and it felt like no time had passed. She was every bit the goddess I'd always imagined. If this was my one chance, I wasn't going to waste it. Afterwards, as we lay face to face, she brushed her fingers down my arm, a soft laugh escaping her. "Looks like I made a big mistake back then," she murmured, barely a whisper. "You full of surprises. Imagine if I'd known, all those wasted years." I wasn't sure what to say. Part of me worried it was all nostalgia for old memories and new temptations, a dangerous combination. I knew I wasn't in her league looks-wise, but I had a good job and wasn't bad-looking. She clearly enjoyed our time together, even if she didn't say it outright. Despite my doubts, our relationship started growing closer. I fell in love with who Lizzie was underneath the surface. When I finally bought an engagement ring, I needed to be sure. We sat down to talk about our future and, more importantly, our views on fidelity. "I don't care about the details of your past, Lizzie," I said as we sat across from each other. "The past is where it belongs. I just need to know that from now on, it's just us, no loopholes, no excuses. I can't deal with anything less." I placed a small black box on the table between us. Her serious expression didn't waver as she looked from the ring box to me. "I'd never cheat on my husband," she said, meeting my gaze. I remembered those words fondly, even years later. It was ironic, considering everything that happened. She'd had countless opportunities to stray over the years, but as far as I knew, she'd always turned them down. But now, the game had changed. Lizzie was a solid 10, maybe even a 12, and I knew I'd never rank that high. I was a 6 at best, and I knew anyone on her level could have come along. But, as far as I knew, for 23 years, she'd acted like a committed wife. I was grateful for those years, but the disappointment still lingered. I'd said, "I love you for life, not just for 23 years." There wasn't a week that went by without Lizzie attracting attention from men, and not just acquaintances. She wasn't just beautiful, she was extraordinary. She used to tell me when someone hit on her, wanting to be open and honest. I liked that, and after a while, I told her I trusted her enough not to need every detail. Only if someone didn't take no for an answer would I want to know, so I could step in if necessary. For me, it was a different story. I didn't date often, and my wedding ring was like a shield. I rarely had women showing interest. Within minutes of meeting anyone, I'd be talking about Lizzie and our kids, practically glowing with pride. It shut down any chance of flirtation before it even started, but I didn't notice it at the time. Lizzie had no idea that I was so focused on her. For 22 years, it felt like a fairy tale, and I thought it was enough to keep us happy. But things were different now, and I wondered if maybe I'd never really seen things for what they were. Rosa Esposito had stirred things up a few years ago. This classic dark-haired beauty, with big brown eyes and a curvy figure, was the type to turn heads everywhere. If she'd worked anywhere else, she would have been the queen bee. But at Super Solutions, she was more like Lizzie's sidekick, given how Lizzie was nearly worshipped there. Rosa wasn't enthusiastic about her marriage of 15 years and, at 42, she openly admitted to having a few affairs, some her husband knew about, others she kept secret. Rosa had a knack for telling stories, especially about her escapades. She loved sharing every detail about what she did, thought, and how it all played out. One day, during a coffee break, she asked Lizzie, "You've really never been with anyone else since you married?" "Come on, Lizzie, you're a rock. I don't buy that you never tempted." Lizzie smiled and hinted that she'd been curious but insisted she'd never cheat on Ray. Over the last few months, Lizzie had started to notice subtle changes. She wasn't getting as many looks in bars and restaurants as she used to. More often, men's attention went to younger women. It stung, and she found herself questioning if she was still desirable enough to spark interest, even playing with the thought of what if? But, what if your husband gave you permission? Rosa asked with a smirk. Lizzie's eyes widened, she'd never even considered it. Rosa could see the wheels turning in Lizzie's head. I suppose it'd be different, Lizzie admitted with a mischievous grin. If I had his blessing. Well, have you ever thought about asking him? Rosa pressed. Anything worth having is worth asking for, you know? The idea was new to Lizzie. For a moment, her face lit up, but then she frowned again. He'd never agree. Never. Rosa rolled her eyes. Do I have to spell it out? There's no need for his permission. Just throw it out there, tell him what you want. If he loves you enough, he'll understand. Sometimes the permission you take for yourself works best. The sound of a car pulling up to the house startled Ray out of a half-sleep. It was about 3 in the morning. He glanced at the clock and then at the nearly empty bottle of Woodford Reserve beside him. Great night, huh? He called out dryly as Lizzie stepped through the door. She looked every bit the stereotype he feared she'd become, a disheveled hair, smudged makeup, and rumpled clothes. She didn't seem remorseful, if anything, she wore a soft, smug grin. She shot back sharply, you didn't have to wait up, you know. He poured another 3 fingers of bourbon, leaned back into his chair, and turned on ESPN. He drifted in and out of sleep, barely aware of the TV as the hours slipped by. Around 9, he stirred from his poor night's sleep, his body aching and stomach rumbling. He heard the shower upstairs and started making breakfast. Normally, Lizzie would have come down in her robe, hair wrapped in a towel, but today she came out an hour later, fully dressed and made up, as if nothing had happened. Did you leave anything for me to eat? She asked, her voice as calm as ever. I made coffee, he replied. But you'll have to make your own food. And now that you're dressed, we need to talk. His tone left no room for argument. Lizzie was thrown off by his calmness. She had expected anger, the kind that would make her world spin sideways. But his unexpected composure unsettled her. Don't you want to know what happened last night? She asked with a hint of superiority, as if expecting him to be dying for details. No, Lizzie. I don't want to hear about last night. I just want to know where you see our marriage going. His tone was quiet but firm, and she knew this wasn't a conversation he'd let slide. She buttered her toast, talking as if it was just another part of her day. I want to try dating a few other men over the next few years. No feelings, just physical stuff. I know I love you, Ray, but I want a little more while I still have my looks. She paused, watching for his reaction, and continued, I've given you everything for 23 years. Now I crave something different. You're amazing in bed, but I want variety. We'll ride off into the sunset together after, and I'll be grateful for this, treating you like a king for the rest of our lives. Ray stirred his coffee, his mind racing with questions. Finally, he spoke up, so this is just about variety? Am I not enough for you? Lizzie tried to answer, but he cut her off. You want an open marriage for a few years and then go back to the way things were? And what about me? Do I get to date other women too? Lizzie tried to suppress a laugh. The idea of her quiet, loyal husband going out on dates was ridiculous to her. But if it would help him accept her terms, she figured it was worth it. Yes, she replied with a shrug. As long as it's physical for you too. Ray's expression was unreadable, but Lizzie saw a glimmer in his eye that unsettled her for the first time. If it were Rosa, what if you went on a date with her? Lizzie smiled slyly and suggested, she's a lovely woman from my office, and she'd be more than willing. She knew her friend wouldn't mind a night with him if it helped Lizzie keep her husband around and open their marriage. Taken aback, Dave stared back at her. The 21-year-old inside him got a thrill at the idea of dating Rosa. but the responsible 47-year-old he'd become knew he couldn't go through with it. I'd be lying if I said I wasn't tempted, but no, Lizzie. Thanks, but no thanks. That would be just as unfaithful as you were last night. Lizzie's grin was quickly replaced by a flash of anger. She yelled, I am not a traitor. He replied calmly, there's no difference in consent. Crossing her arms, she huffed, you'll come around, Dave. I don't care if you like it or not, I'm doing this, she snapped. A few days later, around 11 that morning, Rosa stormed into Lizzie's office. To hell with that prude. Rosa slammed the door behind her. And the horse he rode in on. What? Rosa wasn't exactly following. Wait, I didn't even know I was on the table for this? Hold on, he turned me down? Lizzie nodded, exasperated. Yes. Can you believe it? How could he refuse something like that? She raised an eyebrow, then dramatically ran her hands over her body. Anyway, how'd your date go? Did you have fun, or did Dave manage to ruin that too? Oh, the date was amazing, Lizzie replied, her mood shifting. Jonas really knows how to treat a woman. I haven't felt another man's touch in ages. The variety is nice, though. Now, who should I go after next? Both women burst out laughing as they joked about Lizzie's next move. When Dave didn't immediately serve Lizzie with divorce papers, she felt slightly reassured. They barely talked now, but Dave wasn't rushing to file. He still held onto a thin hope that she'd snap out of this phase in time. He thought he could forgive her if she stopped before it went too far. Hope flickered when she skipped a date the following week. They still weren't sleeping in the same room, and their conversations were minimal, but it was a glimmer of relief. Friday rolled around, and Lizzie was dressed up again, ready to go out. Are you seriously planning to do this again? Dave asked, frustration clear in his voice. Or is it a different person this time? Lizzie rolled her eyes. You didn't hear a word I said, did you? She sighed. It has nothing to do with you, it's all about me. I'm just trying to enjoy life while I can, while I still have my looks. It doesn't mean I love you any less. I just want more. I can't just sit back and watch you and other men have fun, he snapped. I'm not built for that. I can't wait while you sample half the city's male population. I thought I could survive it once, but twice? That's another story. His voice was shaking with frustration. This is the ultimate disrespect, the ultimate betrayal. We're done. Lizzie rolled her eyes, waving her hand with a sarcastic wah gesture. You don't want to lose me. It doesn't have to be all or nothing. Dave had quietly asked his lawyer to prepare divorce paperwork just in case. He didn't want to, but he needed to be ready. He knew he had to talk with their two daughters, Jackie and Michelle, before confronting Lizzie. That Sunday night, he called Jackie, 21, and Michelle, 19. He explained what was happening. Jackie might have known more than she'd let on. You knew this was coming and didn't tell me, he demanded. Dad, please, Jackie replied, her voice tense. I was in a tough spot. No matter what, one of you wouldn't be happy with me. Besides, it's her body and her choice. Enough, Dave cut in firmly. I get it, she put you in the middle, but don't tell me she can just do whatever she wants. We took vows, and they mean something. I understand, Jackie murmured. After a moment, she whispered, I'm sorry, Dad. I really am. At 2 a.m, Lizzie walked in, an hour earlier than usual. She looked worn out. Her weekend with Gabriel Esposito, Rosa's burly cousin, had been intense. She felt a hint of excitement at the idea of another night with Gabriel. Her excitement didn't last long. Later that morning, she found divorce papers on her desk. Lizzie was in shock. She ran to the restroom, feeling the weight of the situation. Rosa soon appeared in the doorway, carrying sympathy but also disapproval. "You knew he'd eventually do something like this," Rosa said. "You really hurt him, Lizzie. It's an eye for an eye. He won't give up on 23 years of marriage easily. Give him a week to stew it over, and he'll be back." Lizzie wiped her eyes and returned to her desk. She dialed Dave's number, her voice wavering with anger and desperation. "You did this to me, Dave? At the office, in front of everyone. I know you're hurting, but I don't deserve this." Coolly, he replied, "Oh, you think you deserve better? What about me, Lizzie? After 23 years, don't I also deserve better than you deciding, on your own, to open up our marriage? Couldn't you have at least let me know if I wasn't right for you, so we could part ways like adults?" Her anger dwindled as she realized just how deep the wound she had inflicted really was, and she fell silent. "No, I don't want a divorce," Lizzie pleaded, her voice breaking. "I still love you, Dave. You still love me." His tone low and fierce, he shook his head. "I might still love you, Lizzie, but every time you spend the night with someone else, it fades just a little more. You think my love is an endless well? I always thought it was, but maybe I was wrong." The proceedings weren't simple. But Dave firmly opposed marriage counseling, though Lizzie's lawyer insisted. Dave remained grim, and when Lizzie looked hopeful as they entered the counselor's office, it was clear she didn't expect what was coming next. The seasoned counselor, Lillian Kamak, sat in a chair at the desk. Before they got started, Lillian quickly cleared the air. "Mrs. Montgomery, did you really tell your husband you were going to date other men for the next few years?" Lizzie was clearly caught off guard, freezing, and Dave bit back a smirk. She wanted to lie, but didn't have a story prepared. "Yes, I did," she whispered. "It's what I want. I don't need anything from him, he wouldn't hurt our marriage." "I think we're done here," Lillian said flatly. "No sense wasting your time, Mrs. Montgomery. I'll tell the judge to end this farce." Lizzie's face reddened. But," she stammered, but Lillian didn't allow her to finish. "If you even thought for a moment that you could justify this to me, then you're worse off than I thought. Frankly, you should be ashamed." Lizzie tried to call and text Dave repeatedly over the next few weeks. Ignoring her messages, he moved into a small apartment nearby. She turned to the daughters, hoping they could convince him to talk. One day, Michelle called him. "You know, Dad, you still love her. Would you give her another chance if she stopped dating other men?" Dave's voice trembled. "She's still seeing other people, right? Even after I served her the papers?" He heard the answer in the silence on the other end. Michelle didn't call back, and she never asked him to change his mind. Rumors of their divorce spread quickly. Lizzie's friends picked up on it, and several single women at his office offered their condolences too. Not all of them were purely sympathetic, Dave could tell. One evening, Lizzie's friend Connie called him. She sounded warm. "I'm really sorry about what you're going through, Dave. I've never been one to pursue a friend's husband, but now you're available, and things are different. I just wanted you to know I'm around if you need anything." She was more open than Dave had ever seen her. Connie and he had known each other for years. Now he wondered how much of his life had been an illusion, and he faced life outside of Lizzie. "I'm flattered, Connie," he replied, really sounding surprised. "But I'm not a free man yet. There are no dates until the divorce is over. I know it might sound silly, but I won't cheat." Connie chuckled. "That's so like you, Dave. One of the things I've always admired about you is that you're always such a Boy Scout. Can I at least count on you to take me out once you're officially single?" Dave smiled and said, "Absolutely. But I'd hate to come between you and Lizzie. You two have been friends for years." Connie brushed it off. "It's not silly. If it's right, it'll happen, but hey, I had to ask." I wouldn't have thought twice if you were just some random guy. It's like I've taken the leash off, Dave said jokingly. Connie was elegant and he could not help but notice. She was a petite, toned Asian beauty, with waist-length black hair that he found captivating. She showed more interest in him than he expected. When Dave's divorce was finalized, he kept his word and called Connie. They had dinner and went to a local jazz club that Saturday night. He seemed a bit uneasy, and Connie gently teased him about it. He admitted, laughing, "I feel like a clueless teenager. I haven't been on a date in over 26 years. She joked, "Don't tell me you're still wearing the same protection you wore back then." "Should I have brought some?" "Wow, I really am rusty," he replied, shaking his head. At the end of the evening, Connie leaned in and kissed him softly. For the first time, Dave looked forward to seeing her again. It wasn't until he took off his wedding ring that he realized how big a deal it was. Now, the empty spot on his finger was drawing attention. Suddenly, several women at the office began to flirt with him. One afternoon, he sat down for lunch with his friend Robert and shared his thoughts. "There are so many beautiful women around here. Why hadn't I noticed this before?" Robert replied, "You, my friend, were just a terrible henpecked man. Other women never entered your mind because you were so in love with Lizzie. She took all your courage. That loyalty showed, and it kept other women at bay." In the first month after the divorce, Dave had been on 4 dates, 2 of them with Connie. He hadn't rushed into anything intimate with any of the women, but he had enjoyed getting to know them. By the second month, he was more comfortable and still keeping a busy social calendar. He was even beginning to feel free for the first time in decades. Meanwhile, Lizzie would tell their daughters that he was just an average guy in his 40s who couldn't even get a date. A month and a half after the divorce, Jackie and Michelle decided to surprise their dad with a visit one Saturday morning. Dave wasn't thrilled about being woken up at 8:30, especially since he'd been up late the night before, entertaining Sonia, a vivacious 25-year-old who was the daughter of a friend. They had enjoyed each other's company, and Sonia was still in his bed when he answered the door. "What's up?" Dave asked as he opened the door, seeing Jackie and Michelle holding bags with bagels, salmon, and cream cheese, grinning. "Good morning, Dad," Jackie said as they walked in. "Thought we'd surprise you with breakfast." Dave laughed, kissed his daughters on the cheek, and walked them to the kitchen table, where they began unpacking their breakfast spread. He didn't know how he was going to explain the visitor sleeping away in his bedroom, but he was glad to have a real moment with his daughters, sharing in the new, complicated chapter of their lives. Jackie and Michelle were unpacking the bagels when Sonia came out of the bedroom, half-buttoned in one of Dave's white shirts, probably with nothing underneath. She flashed him a smile and said, "Oops, I didn't know you had company." "Baby, you could have warned me." No, Sonia," Dave replied, pointing to his daughters, Jackie and Michelle. Sonia chuckled, her eyes twinkling. As she sat down beside him, she brushed her thigh against his arm. The 4 of them chatted casually for a while. Eventually, Jackie brought up the inevitable topic. "Do you talk to Mom at all?" she asked cautiously. Dave's relaxed expression faltered for the first time that morning. Lizzie was still a sensitive subject, but Sonia provided a welcome distraction. Michelle glanced at her father. "Dad, we thought you might be missing Mom by now." "She says she misses you." Dave's face hardened. "Missing her? She's the one who wanted this. Maybe I did at one point, but it was her choice to see other guys. How many has she been with since we split?" Jackie shot Michelle a glare, and Michelle looked away, uncomfortable. They knew their mom had been seeing someone new but hadn't really considered how many men she had dated since. Sonia shrugged. "If it's 2 guys a month for the last 10 months, that's 20 different guys. 30, if it's 3 a month." Jackie shot her a glare sharp enough to cut glass. "Don't blame me for doing the math," Sonia said innocently. Dave tried to smooth things over. "All right, let's not ruin a good morning. Let's just enjoy breakfast. All three women murmured, sorry. So, are you two a couple? Jackie asked, eyeing Sonia. Sonia smiled and replied, oh no, don't worry. Your dad and I are just friends. He's a great guy. We went to a wedding together last night, and yeah, he's kind of a hottie. But I'm not looking to be anyone's stepmom. Jackie rolled her eyes. Yeah, he's a great guy, but he can be a pain sometimes, she said with a smile. But for an old guy, he's still got it. Dave blushed, and Sonia nudged him playfully. Hey, babe, remember, we've got lunch with the newlyweds at the hotel, she said, standing up. I'll grab a quick shower and then we can go. Later, over lunch with their mom, Jackie opened up. Mom, she's around my age. It doesn't look like a fling, and they seem to really enjoy each other. Lizzie tried to brush it off. He probably just got lucky. She's probably just a fling. Jackie raised an eyebrow. Mom, you always seemed fine with Dad until you wanted something more. Why didn't you just cheat? It would have been easier than all this. Lizzie's face tightened. That would have been cheating, Jackie. I thought being upfront would get me what I wanted without breaking us apart. I never thought he'd actually go through with the divorce. Jackie looked at her thoughtfully. I think you mistook his love for weakness, Mom. Was it all worth it? Lizzie's face cracked for the first time. She had believed in Rosa's stories, but things hadn't turned out as she had hoped. She couldn't tell her daughter that the excitement she sought hadn't lived up to her expectations. In her mind, she thought Dave would be grieving, stuck in the past. She didn't realize how attractive he'd be as a single, good-looking, intelligent man with a solid job. She knew he had been dating other women, including her old friend Connie and, more recently, a younger woman barely older than their eldest daughter. Instead of pining away, he was out having a blast, like a single man in his 20s, getting more attention than she'd ever imagined. When Lizzie found out Connie had been out with Dave, she was initially dismissive. But after learning there had been another date, she spoke to her friend privately. I thought we were friends, Connie. I thought you'd be on my side. Us girls have to stick together. Connie wasn't fazed. She raised an eyebrow. Look, Lizzie, he didn't do anything to you. He's a good man, and everything I'd want in a partner. Why shouldn't I date him? Women are practically lining up to go out with him. He's a true gentleman and, might I add, fantastic in bed. Why would you let a guy like that go? Lizzie stood there, stunned. Only now was she beginning to realize how much she'd truly lost. She missed Dave. She hated coming home to an empty house and sleeping alone. Meanwhile, Dave's life was thriving. He hadn't anticipated his life becoming so vibrant, but the new routine suited him. His work was going well, and his social life was even better. He wasn't looking for a long-term commitment yet, but he was enjoying the variety and excitement of his newfound freedom. Mara Goodling was one of Dave's recent dates, and she had intrigued him. She often wore a Chicago Cubs cap perched on her head, with her silver hair done up in a ponytail streaked with purple. She was dressed in light blue Levi's that hugged her shape and a Cubs t-shirt that fit her like a glove. She was 60 years old, full of life, and she caught plenty of admiring glances that night at Wrigley Field. Mara had been Lizzie's employer for many years, and she had met Dave at corporate events over the years. She always thought he was handsome, and having been a widow for 5 years, she decided to reconnect. When she found his number, she didn't hesitate to reach out. They had a date at a fancy restaurant, followed by a concert at the Philharmonic. They ended the evening with a warm kiss on her doorstep. Their next date was a hike. Mara's laughter echoed as Dave struggled to keep up. He always prided himself on staying in shape, but Mara, a seasoned climber, was outpacing him. They ended that day with a passionate moment on her living room rug, following a steamy makeout session on the sofa. Dave was captivated by Mara's blend of sophistication and down-to-earth charm. On their third date, Dave suggested a weekend getaway to Chicago, and Mara happily agreed. Now, sitting beside her at the Cubs game, he couldn't help but think that life after Lizzie was brighter than he ever could have imagined. Mara didn't advertise their relationship, but she wasn't going to hide it either. Meanwhile, Lizzie told co-workers they had divorced over irreconcilable differences, which was a half-truth that suited her. In the 2 years since the divorce, Dave had built meaningful relationships and enjoyed a fulfilling new chapter in life. Most of his partners thought highly of him, with some hoping for something more serious in the future. Lizzie, meanwhile, had taken a different path, pursuing fun and casual encounters. She wasn't looking for relationships, and she enjoyed the attention while she still had it. As Jackie's wedding approached, Lizzie suggested they both attend alone to avoid tension. When Jackie brought it up to Dave over lunch, he raised an eyebrow. "Did this brilliant idea come from you or your mother?" he asked. "Because I'm bringing someone with me. It's my celebration too, and I'm going to enjoy myself. I've even been taking dance lessons since you announced your engagement." Jackie laughed. "Dance lessons? For my wedding?" "That's adorable," she said, but she noticed his serious expression. "Look, Jackie, your mother doesn't want me showing up with someone, but that's her issue. I'm not coming alone. If you're not comfortable telling her, I will. She can bring a date or go alone, but I'm bringing someone." Jackie nodded. "Got it, Dad. But could you maybe bring someone older than me?" Dave grinned. "Of course, sweetheart. But don't be surprised if Sonia and I blow you away on the dance floor." On the wedding day, Dave brought Connie as his date. She looked lovely in a sea-green dress that he'd insisted on buying. Walking Jackie down the aisle was emotional for him, just as other fathers had warned. It turned out to be a wonderful day, with him, Connie, and his daughters dancing well into the night. The only blip was when Lizzie arrived with a date. Dave didn't care, but the man was obnoxious, smirking at everyone and getting too close to other women. Jackie finally asked Lizzie to take him away, and Lizzie, clearly embarrassed, apologized and left with him. Before leaving, though, Lizzie cornered Connie in the restroom. "You're the one who stole my man," she hissed. Connie replied calmly, "I didn't steal anyone. He left you before we even met. You threw away a good man for cheap thrills." Lizzie's face turned red as Connie's words hit home. She bit her lip, staring down, finally grasping the magnitude of what she had lost. After the wedding, Michelle visited her father a few months later, looking restless. "All right, Mitch, what's up?" Dave asked, watching her closely. She flushed. "Dad, sometimes Mom talks about getting back together with you when she's done, you know, with other guys." She hesitated. "You haven't been with her, have you?" Dave's voice was sharp. "My personal life is none of your business." "But no, I haven't been with your mother." "Why are you asking?" Michelle took a deep breath. "I heard her talking with Rosa. She said she has syphilis." Her voice dropped to a whisper. His face shifted from surprise to sorrow. "Thanks for telling me. I guess you were worried?" Michelle nodded. "I just wanted to make sure you were safe. I wasn't sure if they notify people, but I thought you should know." Dave gave a small nod. "Thanks for telling me, Mitch. You don't need to worry about me." A few days later, Mara called. Dave could sense her concern before she even spoke. "And in case you're wondering, no, I haven't been with my ex." "Not just a no, but absolutely not," he assured her. "Believe me, Mara, I understand. She's become quite the scandal lately." "Scandal is putting it mildly," Mara replied. "Her social life is basically a running joke at this point." Meanwhile, Lizzie took the STI diagnosis as a wake-up call. 6 months after being cured, she decided she'd had enough of casual flings and set her sights back on Dave. She figured that without other women around, she'd have a shot at winning him back. "I know he's a great guy, but can't these women see that he's nowhere near my level when it comes to intimacy?" she confided to Rosa over drinks one night. She smirked, realizing it was Rosa who had initially nudged her towards this lifestyle. Dave moving on so easily wasn't something she had ever considered. Yet, to her surprise, his post-divorce life was just as intense as hers, if not more so. Deep down, Lizzie had to admit that Dave seemed much happier now. One day, out of the blue, Lizzie called Dave. He hadn't heard from her in almost 2 years, so he assumed one of their daughters had given her his number. "Hi, Dave," she purred, trying to sound sweet. "I think it's time we talked." Keeping his tone flat, Dave replied, "I thought we agreed not to talk until after Michelle's wedding." "Is that not the case anymore?" Lizzie sighed. "You're still the same, pretending you don't want me. But you know what? Deep down, you still love me." "I know you do." Her desperation was evident, but Dave wasn't swayed. He'd moved on, and she needed to accept that. "You think the world revolves around you," he said coldly. "Look, Lizzie, maybe you should have just cheated and kept me in the dark. But no, you needed to rub it in my face." "I told you because I didn't want to cheat behind your back," she protested. "That doesn't make it any less of a betrayal. You only did it because you thought I'd never leave. You assumed I'd stick around no matter what," Dave replied, his tone sharp. "Yes, you gorgeous, maybe even a 12 out of 10. But guess what? I don't have to live in your shadow. Other women value me for who I am, and they respect me in ways you never did." Her voice shook as she whispered, "You did love me, Dave." "I did," he replied, emphasizing the past tense. "I don't need someone who's so self-centered that they can't respect me." He hung up, took a deep breath, and turned to Sonia, who was sitting next to him. "Ready for round 2?" he asked with a smile. In time, Sonia found her soulmate and married, but Connie and Mara remained close to Dave. He never remarried, but the relationships with both women were special in their own way. Years later, Connie and Mara even joined him at Michelle's wedding. Lizzie came alone and, when she complained to Michelle, she got no sympathy. "It's Jackie and her family first, and then Connie and Mara," Michelle said. "They put Dad's happiness above their own, which is more than I can say for some people." Lizzie was taken aback. Michelle added, "You left because you were scared of getting old and assumed Dad had no options. You thought he'd let you do whatever you wanted. But you were wrong, Mom." Dave was content with his new life, even if it wasn't the one he had originally envisioned. He had moved on and found happiness on his own terms. Lizzie, meanwhile, wasn't lacking in male attention. Her beauty still drew men to her, but none of her relationships had the depth of what she once shared with Dave. Looking back, Lizzie realized she had miscalculated terribly. She never expected Dave to move on so easily. Even as she tried to rationalize it, she couldn't shake the thought, how did I get this so wrong? She was a 12 out of 10, and he was just a 6, how did it end this way?